It's a beautiful description of the Christian life. We receive him, we believe in what he's done for us, and we enter into the lifelong process of becoming like him.
This is Living Truth.
Come on, church. Let's continue to worship him together. Sing joy.
Last week, we looked at how the people of Bethlehem didn't recognize Jesus, didn't receive him, didn't make space for him in the inn. We looked at the reality of how Joseph's own ancestors, his own tribe, his own family, didn't recognize or receive the Messiah. In John chapter 1, verse 12, we're told that yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. It's a beautiful description of the Christian life. We receive him, we believe in what he's done for us, and we enter into the lifelong process of becoming like him. And today in Matthew chapter 2, we're going to look at a group of people who follow a light to worship the King of Kings and eventually receive him. We're going to look at two groups of people who encounter Jesus but walk away with two very different experiences. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, we read this. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. We just got to pause for a moment because sometimes we read these stories or we hear them at Christmas time and we become overly familiar with them. You have to understand that if you were a first century Jew in Jerusalem at the time that this caravan shows up, it would have caught your attention. This wasn't a normal event in the daily life of Jerusalem. Most theologians believe that the Magi are from Babylon, from the kingdom of Babylon. These guys have left from what we would know as modern-day Baghdad and traveled all the way to the Jerusalem. A 900-mile journey they've just taken. And when they rolled up to the city, there wouldn't just be 3 wise men like we see in so many of our nativity scenes. This was actually a year to 2 years after the birth of Jesus. There would have been 30 to 60 camels rolling deep in this caravan that's just arrived at Jerusalem. So this is an official party that has shown up. And people throughout Jerusalem would certainly be asking the question, what has caused 30 to 60 wise men to come from a foreign nation, travel a dangerous journey, 900 miles across the desert, to worship a king born in Judea? I mean, even that wouldn't make sense to them. They could understand an official delegation from another nation going to Rome to greet a new Caesar, because Rome was the dominant world superpower of the day. Delegations would go to Rome and ask what Caesar has been born, or might present gifts to Caesar and worship Caesar, but to make a 900-mile journey and go to Jerusalem, which wasn't a center of influence, wasn't a center of power, this just would not make sense in the first century. And then it begs the question, who are these wise men and why have they traveled so far? They reference that they saw his star arrive in the east, and they've followed this star. And certainly there might have been a sign in the heavens, but is that enough for someone to make a 900-mile journey? One begins to dig deeper to understand why the wise men left their country and traveled this far to worship a king who is in a region that isn't a center of influence. And when you start to dig into the backstory of the wise men, it takes you back to the Old Testament, all the way to the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar ruled over everything, and God started to speak into his life. In Daniel chapter 2, we read about King Nebuchadnezzar having a very disturbing dream, and he assembles all the spirituality of Babylon. He gathers all the astrologers, enchanters, diviners, sorcerers, whatever, you name it, and asks them to interpret the dream. But there's one catch. He won't tell them what the dream is. They have to figure that out as well. Something unheard of. And Daniel and his friends pray and ask God to reveal the mystery to them. And God does. Daniel appears before King Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, Nebuchadnezzar, in your dream you saw a great statue, and that statue represents 5 different kingdoms. You are the head of gold. You're the first kingdom. After you, 4 more kingdoms are going to come, and then God is going to establish his own kingdom on the earth. And in Daniel 2, verse 44, we read this, in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. Daniel announces this to King Nebuchadnezzar, and he's overwhelmed with the reality of the vision that he's been given. That happened hundreds of years before the arrival of the Christ. Daniel turns into a rock star in Babylon. As you read chapters 3, 4, 5, 6, Daniel is used by God and turns into one of the wisest wise men in the history of wise men. I mean, he becomes a rock star in Babylon. Everybody would have known about Daniel. And in chapter 7 of Daniel, he has a vision. He gets a glimpse forward of this coming kingdom. And in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, he says this, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Then in chapter 9, Daniel has another vision, and he gets a glimpse into the timeline that all these kingdoms are going to come to pass. and he prophesies when this is all going to happen. He announces 70 weeks, 490 weeks are going to pass between the prophecy and the fulfillment. And so when that star appears in the east, these wise men from Babylon, they were familiar with the prophecies of Daniel. They probably looked at chapter 2 and started to track the 4 kingdoms that had emerged on the global scene and dominated life. And that time has passed. And the 77s, and they had done the math, and when this star appears in the east, these wise men are following the prophecies of Daniel and the sign in the heavens above, and they are driven by faith, traveling 900 miles to worship this king, because, as Daniel predicted, his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. All nations on earth will worship him. That is why a caravan of 30 to 60 people have shown up into Jerusalem. But what is astounding in Matthew chapter 2 is that the chief priests, the teachers of God's word, the expert theologians, the people of God, the people of Bethlehem, the people of Jerusalem, those who have memorized the prophecies of Daniel, they all had access to the same information, didn't follow the signs, didn't interpret that the Messiah has come. And it's not like they were without witnesses. We looked last week how in the city of Bethlehem, in the town of Bethlehem, when he was born, angels appeared to shepherds who were watching their sheep in the fields nearby. And the angels announced, "Today a Savior has been born to you in the town of David. He is Christ the Lord. Go and you'll find him in a manger." And the shepherds do that, and the shepherds start to report to all the people around Bethlehem and Jerusalem that this has taken place, that the Christ has been born. They might have even told them it's Joseph and Mary's son. Also, when Joseph and Mary take baby Jesus to the temple to dedicate him and give up the offering, they're met by 2 people that lived basically within the temple, Simeon and the prophetess Anna. And they both prophesy over the Christ. Certainly news of this would have traveled in the city of Jerusalem. News of what the shepherds declared that they witnessed would have traveled throughout the region. But seemingly, the experts in the law, the chief priests, they've disregarded all of it. Maybe they thought to themselves, you know, these shepherds, they like to drink wine at night. They probably drank too much. Sure, you saw an angel. Sure, Mary and Joseph's son is the Messiah, this poverty-stricken couple who have some scandal going on even within their own family. And so they were written off. But then into Jerusalem, about a year to a year and a half after these events, a huge caravan shows up from 900 miles away and says, "We have followed the prophecies of Daniel. The King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the one whose authority will never end. Where is he so that we may worship him?" Now, I wonder what it was like for the Magi when there was blank stares staring back at them. Herod the Great, greatly disturbed, we're told. In the Greek, that means deeply troubled, alarmed, agitated. The wise men have been led by faith, but Herod is led by fear. He sees Jesus as a threat to his control. Wise men have showed up to Jerusalem to worship the king. Herod desires to wipe out this king. Because look at what Herod does next. Herod's alarmed as to this threat to his rule and a threat to Rome. And in verse 4, we're told when he had called together all the people's chief priests, teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea, for this is what the prophet has written, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Bethlehem is only 5 miles away from Jerusalem. It's around some mountains, so there's no line of sight to Bethlehem. But it's right next door. And again, this group of wise men have, by faith, followed the prophecies of Daniel, seen the stars in the heavens, and made their way 900 miles to Jerusalem. And the experts in the law, who knew of the exact same prophecies, are seemingly not recognizing that the Messiah has been born. Herod gathers together the Magi secretly after he's discovered where this Christ is to be born, where this King of Kings is to be born. In verse 7, he gathers the Magi secretly to find out the exact time that this star appeared. And he says, "Go and make a careful search, report back to me." Why? So that I may worship him as well. Is Herod the Great really interested in worshiping this new king? Absolutely not. We remember from last week, Rome's motto was peace through victory. Peace through my boot on your neck. Peace through crushing anyone who's a threat to Rome. Herod doesn't want to worship Jesus. He wants to annihilate Jesus. And we're told in verse 9 that the Magi go on their way from Jerusalem. They come to Bethlehem, and they discover where Jesus is. And we're told in verse 10, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Last week, we looked at how when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, there was no room for him in the inn. We talked about how that would have jumped off the page to a first century reader. What do you mean there's no room for them? Joseph's whole family, who descend from a royal line, the line of David, would have been in Bethlehem at the same time. What do you mean there was no room for them? Joseph's family certainly would have opened their homes to him, would they not? Last week, we looked at the reality that Jesus' own village, his own ancestral tribe, his own people didn't recognize him as the Messiah. They didn't receive him. They didn't make room for him. And then the shepherds came along and they reported that the Christ the Lord had been born, and they had probably told the village, hey, Mary and Joseph gave birth to the Messiah, but seemingly Bethlehem has ignored all that witness. Bethlehem has said, you know what, you shepherds, you're a disreputable bunch. You probably drank too much out in the fields. Sure, you saw angels. But then about a year to a year and a half later, this massive caravan shows up. The caravan that just showed up to Jerusalem and greatly disturbed the whole city makes their way to Bethlehem. One has to believe that a small town like that, where things like this don't happen, would have caught their attention. And to their shock, when they asked, where's the miraculous one been born? And they're pointed over to Mary and Joseph's house. They make their way over. Certainly the whole town of Bethlehem is in a stir now as this caravan arrives. If Jerusalem was disturbed, Bethlehem would also be disturbed. And wise men who have traveled 900 miles through the desert, how shocked would they be when they don't go to a king's palace, but they go to a humble home? We know that Mary and Joseph didn't have a lot of resources. When they dedicated him at the temple on the 8th day, they used the offering that poor people used. How shocked would the Magi have been that the one who Daniel speaks of, this Son of Man whose authority knows no bounds, who will establish an eternal kingdom, who has all authority, and the heavens have announced his coming, how surprised would the Magi have been when they walk up to a humble home and they encounter a 12 to 16-month-old baby boy. This King of Kings, the creator of all things were made through him. Without him, nothing was made. 250 billion stars, 100 billion galaxies. The wonderful counselor, the Prince of Peace, God with us, born into the most humble of circumstances. after a 900-mile journey, thinking about the arrival of this King of Kings, driven by the prophecies of Daniel. The wise men encounter Jesus, and we're told that they bow down on their faces and worshiped him. It would have been a striking scene for any citizen in Bethlehem to see these dignitaries worshiping the son of Mary and Joseph. And they present him with expensive gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The wise men worship Jesus, and then in verse 12, something astounding takes place. We read in verse 12, having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When you read verses 1 through 11, the wise men are following Scripture. They're following the prophecies of Daniel, the signs in the heavens. They are walking by faith. But when you get to verse 12, God is speaking to them directly after they worship Jesus. He gives them a revelation just like he gives to Joseph and Mary. And what we take away from Matthew chapter 2 is the reality of what the Apostle John talks about in his gospel. John 1:10 says, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. The people of Bethlehem didn't recognize or receive him. The people of Jerusalem didn't recognize his coming. The chief priests, the teachers in the law, the expert theologians, the people of God, they did not recognize him. But just as John says in verse 12 of his gospel, yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. These wise men have received, they've believed, and they've become. They followed the prophecies of Daniel to worship Jesus. And at first, they're following stars and prophecies, but 12 verses later, God is now speaking to them directly. And because they have received and believed and become, they're obedient to God's revelation. They don't go back to Herod as they had arranged, and they go back by another route, escaping. Then in verse 13, Joseph and Mary are warned that their life is under threat. After the wise men leave, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So Joseph and Mary get up in the middle of the night. And when the residents of Bethlehem wake up the next day, the wise men have departed by another route. And Joseph, Mary, and this one who is the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy, this King of Kings and this Lord of Lords, he's gone overnight. And this one whose authority knows no bounds has become King of the refugees, because he is now walking the refugee road on his way to Egypt, because Herod is seeking to kill him. And sometimes when I come back to these Christmas stories now, when I think of the gritty details and the human element at play within the Scriptures, it's not the stained glass Christmas that I encounter. When I think of Jesus' own family looking for a place to rest on the refugee highway, worried because a tyrant is after their child, Herod gives orders to murder all the children in the vicinity of Bethlehem, 2 years old and younger. The massacre of the innocents takes place. When I think of all that gritty reality, I can't help but see similarities happening all around the world today. How Jesus is incarnated and at work in the kingdoms of the world, bringing light to the darkness on the refugee highway today. When I see these images and I go back to the Scriptures and encounter a different Jesus, a Jesus that I never knew, when I look at that first Christmas, The words of the Apostle John thunder into my mind. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. I'm amazed that the people of Bethlehem, Joseph's own family, the people of Jerusalem, the experts in the law, those who had memorized the scriptures, they didn't recognize, they didn't receive the Messiah, but somehow wise men from Babylon did. They didn't even recognize him. But then I catch myself and I wonder, do I recognize Jesus? Do I recognize him in the face of pregnant women who remind us of the story of Mary and Joseph, where there's no room for them? Do I recognize him in the face of mothers looking for shelter and a safe place for their children, as their children lay on them beside them in the floor and she doesn't know where they're going to eat? Do I recognize that Jesus at times is still incarnated in these situations? He knows the refugee's journey so well because he lived it. Church, we have another opportunity today to receive Jesus this Christmas. Jesus says in Matthew 25, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. When I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick or in prison, you visited me. And Jesus says to us in Matthew 25, whatever you did for them, you did for me. And we're told in Matthew 25, the righteous answer, when? When did we see you hungry? When did we see you thirsty? What it reveals to us is that we don't know that when we're ministering to this need, we're actually ministering to Jesus. It doesn't matter the amount that we give. It's the heart of worship with which we give it. And he takes our obedience and he blesses the lives of others through it.
Join us next week for a message from our guest speaker. This is Living Truth.
As we journey through the Christmas story together this season, seeking God to open our eyes and illuminate our minds to the incarnation in new and fresh ways, and as we celebrate our Savior, who willingly came into the world, taking on human flesh because of his love for us, let's ask God to stir our hearts for those who are wandering in the darkness today. In a time that has brought great loss, extreme limitations, and profound uncertainty into our lives, we find true hope in Jesus. And God is calling his church, you and me, to carry this light of hope into every dark corner of our world. Living Truth is a media ministry of the People's Church, dedicated to shining Christ's light into homes and communities all around the world through the television and internet. For over 40 years, your faithful commitment has been the vehicle that has welcomed thousands upon thousands of people into Christ's family. Each year, we ask you to stand with us, and each year, you respond with incredible generosity. We do this together, and we simply cannot do this without you. To help support our media ministry, you can send a check to the address on your screen. To donate with a credit card, call toll-free 1-888-269-6085. You can also make a secure donation online by visiting us at livingtruth.ca. Living Truth is a registered charity, and all donations are tax deductible. The true light that gives light to everyone came into the world, and that light is still incarnating through Christ's church today. Thank you for being the church. Together, we can shine brighter and welcome more into Christ's family. On behalf of the Living Truth team, I wish you and yours a very Merry Christmas. God bless you.